Upon, who is a section chair for SPE Ghana. And we are delighted and happy to have in our midst renowned people in the industry. I'm going to start with the introduction of Mrs. Barbara Mami Esi Ando. And we have in our midst Dr. Jin-Sung Suk. We also have in our midst today to share with us Professor Rita Okoro Afo. We also have Professor William Ampoma. And then we have Dr. Tioa Champon. Today's technical workshop will be on the topic, finding a balance between energy security, affordability, and sustainability, the African way. With our renowned speakers, we're going to start off with Professor, and also in our midst today, we have Professor Wumi, who will be our guest speaker. And before we start the program, before we delve into today's topic, we're going to have our guest speaker to give us the welcome address. Hello, please, can you hear me?
Okay, yeah, so before Prof comes in, once again, as the moderator said, we are delighted to have such renowned experts on the global knowledge base as far as energy transition is concerned. And we want to welcome you officially as a session, that's SPE Ghana session, to this wonderful workshop. We hope that to be fruitful and knowledge-based enough to equip you with capacity as far as energy transition is concerned. I'd like to reiterate the fact that SPE, our main mission is to disseminate, exchange technical knowledge concerning exploration, development, and production of oil and gas resources and other related technologies for public benefit. So in more or less an NGO. And in other sense, also to provide opportunities for professionals to enhance their technical and professional competence. So one will ask, why is an oil and gas society interested in energy transition? If you take a look at today's energy mix, we understand the role that oil and gas play in this mix, I mean, globally or even regionally. So, and the fact that oil and gas companies now need to readjust or re-strategize to adapt to clean and sustainable sort of fuel. And that is why we as SPE is very interested in this topic. So without much ado, I will now invite Professor Linda Wumi, our immediate past Africa Regional Director, to give us his welcome address. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, please. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, please.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you, and I think I'm hearing myself.
No, Doc, we can hear you clear. Hello, Prof. Hello, Prof. Hello, Prof.
I can hear you, please.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, gentlemen, I hope you can hear me.
Loud and clear, Prof.
Okay, thank you. All right. Again, I was just about to recognize the excellent job you are doing in Ghana. And I'm sure that posterity will remember you for the way you are spending your energy and time to bring young professionals to the competent level that is required, and to even invite young people to understand that petroleum engineering is still a noble profession to adopt. So please keep the flag flying. I appreciate the opportunity. In fact, I'm supposed to be on my way to the airport, but I say Opong cannot invite me and I don't come. And I understand I have just about 5 to 10 minutes, so I'm not going to ramble too much. I always said in every forum, 3 people that you don't want to give microphone to are the pastors, the professors, and the politicians, because they can talk and talk and talk. But basically my theme is balancing energy supply security and sustainability. And I want to say that economic growth and human development do matter in this process of balancing global energy security and energy and environmental sustainability. So the African ways to keep in perspective, even as we pursue this noble goal, the importance of economic development and human capital development and society welfare maximization. If you optimize energy security, optimize sustainability, and in the process, maximize energy crisis, which have implications on human development in Africa, then something is not going right. So energy supply security dimensions that we must keep in focus when doing this balancing act is 1, energy affordability, energy availability, energy adaptability, and energy accessibility. These important 4 dimensions in the pursuit of energy security and environmental sustainability are very key if value is to be optimized in Africa. There's apparently nothing you can do without energy. And it is important that energy access is very critical. Energy accessibility is critical, availability is critical, and affordability is critical. And very relevant in this energy transition pursuit that the global world is targeting to accomplish in 2050. Interestingly, energy must be adapted or adopted to add value. And that makes technology advancement very critical in this journey. Abundant energy resources, such as fossil fuel,
Hello? We seem to have lost Prof. Hello, everyone. I don't know if it's me, but can we hear Prof?
Yes, please.
Okay.
My internet is intermittent. I'll just continue. It's being recorded.
Welcome.
What I was trying to say is that generally, energy supply security is at risk when there is high dependence on imported energy sources for a domestic economy. And that's why it is very important for us to know that from using the abundant energy resources in Africa to be able to grow our human capital. And we have to be careful that we make the economy of Africa that is actually not moving the way it's supposed to move to be able to accomplish the purpose. In spite of many economies in Africa barely having potential to adapt the renewable energy. It's important that Africa is not folding hands, because you can see so many countries that are doing whatever they can to be able to make sure that renewable energy is mixed. In fact, if you look at Ghana, even in the late Nkrumah's day, energy supply was playing a key part in the energy strategy of Africa. Many African countries do not have the economic and technical ability to utilize renewables as of now. So we must build the grounds up. We must begin to think in terms of developing the capital, human resources capital that is required. And that's why you see in many petroleum engineering, some of the engineering techniques that can be adapted to renewable energy development have been incorporated. Energy affordability is another human capital developments must expand in order to guarantee affordability from the point of view of having enough income. Yes, anything that you are doing today must be sustainable for the future. And that is why one will continue to encourage African policymakers to be transformational in the way they think rather than being transactional. And we encourage African countries not to just allow grants and aid on what they have, just in order to be able to satisfy the world. We must attain energy security. We must not attain energy security and energy sustainability at the expense of energy equity. I know your time is very important. So let me conclude by re-echoing the assertion that energy transition is here, but it is not static, it is dynamic. The displacement of any dominant energy source does not automatically eliminate the energy source from the energy supply mix. This is what I want to continue to hammer into the mindset of the policymaker in Nigeria. In Africa. Listen, petroleum is not going anywhere. The world is again, in the next 60 years, petroleum will still continue to be an energy supply mix. So Africa must not close their eyes to the dynamics that we are observing in the energy transition journey. But at the same time, they must not abandon their petroleum resources for development. Africa needs a strategic thinking approach to the transition dynamics beyond the traditional reactive or what I call ad hoc committee approach. African leaders in the private and public sector must continue to talk the talk of energy transition and adapt strategic plans to be able to join the trend. Sustainable optimization of an economy for national development requires energy accessibility, affordability, and sustainability. And no energy source should be left out of the energy supply mix. Nevertheless, let me conclude. Africa must learn the lesson from no smoking campaign for many years before it took traction. I remember when I was a young guy, there are places that are designated for you if you don't want smoking. Today, it is reversed. So I want you must begin to have energy transition plan, but I advise you to put all the energy sources in the tank. Listen, comparative advantage must not be surrendered, but you must do things the right way and do the right things accordingly. Using petroleum revenue management tools to drive the linkage necessary for the oil sector to drive the emerging economies is critical to absorb the unintended consequences on African economies if we change too rapidly. Petroleum revenue must not be used for transfer payments. Petroleum revenue must be used for economic development, infrastructure development, and human development. I'm really blessed to have this panel who are here to be able to give us some of the important tools that we may need to examine the challenges that Africa and environmental sustainability. Yes, the environment must be sustainable, but human capital development and human economic development must not be sacrificed. Thank you very much, and I wish you a wonderful deliberation.
Thank you very much, Professor Wumi Iledare. I think that was a wonderful speech. And one key note I've taken is that Africa as a continent needs to take a stand. We should be able to use our resources to develop our continent just as it has been done in the European and the Americas. Thank you very much for your speech and your topic. I think it was very, very helpful. Please, if you have any questions, you can just put them in the chat box and then we can take those questions along the way. Without wasting much of our time, I'm going to introduce Mrs. Barbara Mami Esi Ando. She is an energy economist and analyst, and she's going to give us a huge elaboration on the impact of energy debt on Ghana's energy transition plan. Mrs. Barbara Mami Esi, do you have a presentation or you just like to speak with it? But before you start, my first question will be that, what is the biggest barrier to energy transition? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. I'm grateful to be here. I hope you can all hear me.
Loud and clear.
Okay, that's great. You asked what is the biggest barrier to energy transition? And let me just ask, is this in Ghana specifically, or you mean in general in Africa?
So I'm asking the impact of energy debt on Ghana's energy transition plan.
All right, great. If you don't mind, I have a presentation to share. So I can go ahead and share my screen.
Yeah, please go ahead.
All right. Can you still see, please?
No.
All right, please give me a second. All right, I believe you can see it now.
No, I think reversing screen is sharing. So one person has to stop first. Reversing.
Oh, okay. All right, so shall I go ahead while we wait?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, great.
Let's try again.
All right. Yes, I've shared it again.
Now we can see. Can you please put in the presentation mode?
Sure, I will.
Thank you.
All right. So I think that this topic is very important, specifically for Ghana. And by sharing this topic, I'm hoping that other African countries can learn from our story or our experience. In this day and age in Ghana, you cannot speak about any plans in the energy sector without considering the energy debt. And as we go ahead, I would of course, discuss why such an assessment of the impact of the energy debt is very important. So quickly, I just want to answer a few questions concerning why this assessment is important, concerning how the energy debt came about, so that if any African country is on this trajectory, we can do something about it before we consider energy transition. I'll talk a bit about the component and the quantum of the debt, about Ghana's energy transition plans, about the impact of the debt on the energy sector in general, and about the impact of the debt on transition plans and what Ghana can do currently. So why is this assessment important? Working in the space for a number of years now, I realized that it is foremost in the minds of all policymakers, all political partners that we have to work with. And every single plan currently in the energy sector must take cognizance of the debt. As it stands now, Ghana is going through a process of trying to recover its energy sector before it makes other policies to foster energy transition. And the energy debt has been a key bottleneck to a lot of investment decisions, as you see going ahead. And it's also a significant component of Ghana's overall debt stock. So the energy debt is contributing so significantly to the general public debt that we have in Ghana, even though the public debt issues are also quite deep. And I picked a quote from a study done by ASAP, and it says that the challenges in the energy and extractive sector contribute significantly to current economic challenges in Ghana. Consequently, efforts at economic recovery may not succeed without addressing the key challenges that plague the energy sector. So how did the energy debt in Ghana come about? Over a period of more than 2 decades, we've been accumulating this debt, and it's mainly been fueled by non-payment of electricity bills by public institutions, mostly government agencies and politically connected businesses. And the energy sector as well, we have a very high rate of technical and commercial losses. I mean, according to our Public Utilities Regulatory Commission, they are setting acceptable ranges for technical and commercial losses. But for our power utilities in Ghana, our percentage is quite high, even when you compare it regionally. And currently it's costing over $400 million annually. And I mean, a main portion of the commercial loss is coming from the poor revenue collection by the distribution utilities in Ghana. And if you would look to the right side of the slide, you see a lot of snippets of issues concerning this debt in the sector or the low collections. For instance, a toll was reported to be cut off from the national power grid over a 26 million CD debt. ECG is said to owe the independent power producers over 1 billion. And ECG is always talking about an inability to be viable. So that's one main issue. Another thing is that according to our electricity tariff build-up, electricity tariffs are not cost reflective in Ghana, and we have an automatic adjustment formula that is supposed to capture all the changes that are happening on the economic scene to give a reflective tariff. But this formula is not applied consistently. Also, there are exchange rate impacts. You know that in the power sector, the costs, which is the generation, the fuel costs, are all denominated in dollars. But our power sector utilities, especially for distribution, they collect revenue in cedis. So there's always an exchange rate impact. And even when tariffs are increased, this impact is always doused by the depreciating value of the cedi. Also, another key thing that has compounded the debt, especially in the last couple of years, is the poorly contracted power purchase agreement, especially as response to emergency or power crisis. And now we have to make payments for excess or unutilized capacity, which is over 500 million per year, the last time I checked. Apart from this, there are other institutional inefficiencies of the power utilities. I mean, when you go deep into our constitution and our governance structures, most of the heads of these institutions are, contracted politically, and most of the staff of these institutions are bloated. And there's a whole lack of transparency and accountability about how the appointments are done. And because of the institutional inefficiency, they contribute to the losses of the power utility. So we have on record about 3 billion of annual cumulative losses between 2018 and 2020. There are more snippets of how I mean, we complain about the appointment of the heads of such institutions. And we also talk about the PPAs. We already started a process of renegotiation, and we'll probably talk about that a bit more later. So usually it is better to understand exactly what we mean when we say energy debt in Ghana. We have the legacy debt, which is a debt that has accumulated over a particular period with its associated payments. And then we have the recurrent under recoveries, for example, the debts that are owed to the IPPs because we are not able to pay for the power generated. And all these constitutes the energy debt. And as at 2022, the portfolio of the debt includes debts for fuel that was purchased for power generation, debts to IPPs, excess capacity payments, and interest payments as well. So what I would also like to bring to mind is we cannot have a huge amount and say this is the exact figure of our debt, especially because there's the legacy part and there's the recurrent part. And of course, the government has already undertaken some measures to defray some of these debts. So it's more of a flow than a stock, or perhaps a stock and a flow. So over the period 1992 to 2015, we accumulated about $2.4 billion of debt. And in between 2017 and 2019, another 2 billion. And the of course, rate of accumulation is faster between 2017 and 2019 because of the PPAs that were negotiated, which led to excess capacities that we needed to pay for at a rate of between 25 to $42 million per month. So as at January 2019, the legacy figure was quoted at $2.7 billion. And government, of course, has made some payments. We were able to pay 2.3 billion between 2020 and 2021 to clear outstanding debts. But as at 2022, there's still some debt outstanding to the independent power producers of 1.3 billion, gas debts of 346 million, and also the ESLA bond principal of 8.3 billion. Yeah. So the ESRP looked at the financial situation of the sector and predicted that the energy debt can reach about $12 billion by 2023 if steps are not taken to forestall debt accumulation and, of course, the financial viability of the sector. In 2015, there was the Energy Sector Levy Act, ESLA, which was passed to consolidate all taxes and levies collected for the clearance of the debt, and also as a source of funding for long-term investment in the energy sector. However, the levies gathered so far have been insufficient to cover the debt, even though payments have been made since 2016. And also the monies accrued are sometimes channeled towards other sources rather than debt recovery. We have a report for 600 million for pension arrears in 2017, and there are many more of these examples. Now, the reason why this is important is that because of these things that are going on, how the debt came about, the quantum of debt that we have, and the efforts that are being made at debt restructuring and the sort of lacunas with the debt restructuring efforts, what it means for us is that the debt might linger for a longer time than we would like. And of course, this means that it has implications for all other policies and plans that we want to institute in the energy sector, including energy transition planning. So Ghana has recently developed a national energy transition framework, which we are very excited about. And the span of the period is 2022 to 2070. And the aim is to decarbonize the energy sector and reduce emissions by 45% by 2030. Those are some of the medium-term plans, short to medium-term plans. And the main measures to achieve this include RE penetration by 10%. This is still for 2030. And then conversion of all thermal plants to natural gas by scaling up to 120 million standard cubic feet of natural gas, replacing LCO. And then the integration of nuclear power into Ghana's energy mix. There's actually also a mention of hydrogen. And I realize that we'll be talking a lot about hydrogen today, which is good. So the plan aims to guarantee energy security through diversifying our energy mix in Ghana. And this is going to include 21 gigawatts of renewable energy. And the plan also aims to provide cost-efficient electricity generation And for the cost of energy, it is envisioned or planned that the new energy mix will supply affordable electricity at a generation cost of below 45 cents per kilowatt hour. Demand is projected to be 380,000 gigawatt hours, and this will be met with an installed capacity of 83 gigawatts. And 25% of this installed capacity is going to be from renewable energy, which is good. Also, we are considering greenhouse gas mitigation. And in the best case scenario, it is approximated that 200 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent will be mitigated. The interesting part of the transition plan, which we need to pay attention to, is the fact that the estimated financing required to carry out the plan is about $562 billion as it stands now. So the impact of the energy debt on the energy sector in general is what I'd like to discuss right now, because the debt has far-reaching both direct and indirect consequences on the economy as a whole, on the energy sector specifically. And as I said before, there's no planning or progress that can be made in the sector without taking into consideration the quantum of the debt and how it can be dealt with. And of course, this has implications for energy transition. So in general, you'd realize that the energy debt has implications for power generation, becomes more expensive. If you look at our electricity tariff, a lot of it has the components of the tariff have levies and taxes, and these are imposed through the SLR to be able to collect monies to defray the energy debt. The continuous imposition of such levies and taxes means that going forward, we are definitely going to experience more expensive power. As it stands now, power in Ghana is relatively more expensive. And at the same time, the debt constricts the development of the delivery of power, because the government is unable to purchase fuel for power generation and is unable to pay the IPPs. And of course, consequences mean that we might have power outages. As you can see from the snippet on the right, as current as early this month, the IPPs were threatening that they cannot guarantee power generation. And the energy debt, of course, constrains the operation of the power sector utilities. They usually report losses, and they are not financially viable. And as of now, they owe the IPPs over $1 billion US dollars. So, of course, looking on the broader scope, the energy debt definitely jeopardizes our ability to meet the SDG 7, because power is not affordable, even though we've achieved good access. And of course, because of the energy debt, we cannot say that our power is very sustainable. And this is also a very important point, that money that could have been channeled towards socioeconomic development is channeled towards debt servicing. So if you look at the critical sectors in Ghana, health, education, gender, social protection, about 32% of the amount that is earmarked for the energy sector shortfalls could have been expended towards looking at these socioeconomic sectors. Government plans to spend about $4.1 million in those critical sectors, compared to 8.2 billion that it's spending to offset energy sector shortfalls. So, I mean, without the energy debt and without the servicing, if we could have used that money well, we could have had some socioeconomic improvements. That's just a comparison for us to see the depth of the situation. So now we are looking at the impacts of the energy debt on the energy transition plans themselves. The first thing is financing, as mentioned before. The Ghana's energy transition plan, as it stands now, requires huge amounts of financing, up to $562 billion over the period. And I'd like to use a proxy here, because a clear marker for Ghana's commitment towards climate change and energy transition are Ghana's NDCs, which also require financing. So as it stands, 8.2 billion is earmarked to offset energy debt that is currently in this year, 2023. And this amount could have been used to fund some of the NDCs as a conduit for energy transition. So on this table, we see the climate objective of the NDCs, the sector, the policy action, the NDC program of action, and then the earmarked or the yes, investment that is required. And I just highlighted a few of them. This is the oil and gas sector. The policy action is to decarbonize this oil and gas production and to minimize flaring in all three oil and gas fields. And the investment amount that is required is just $31.5 million, which could easily be cleared if we didn't have to pay for the energy debt. Another example is in the energy sector again, to provide low carbon electricity generation. And one of the things is to switch from fuel oil to gas and thermal plants, which requires $0.1 million. And the conversion of single cycle to combined cycle thermal plant, that also requires just $141 million. So all these could easily be funded, assuming we didn't have the huge debt overhang. And of course, is on an all other things equal assumption. Yes, and renewable energy penetration is one of the things that have been affected because of the energy debt. There's a moratorium that was placed on new renewable energy projects since 2017 because of the issues of excess generation or excess capacity on the grid. And of course, because till date, we are still making payments towards defraying this excess capacity charges. So definitely this directly has an impact because it curtails renewable energy investment and of course jeopardizes our ability to meet the 10% penetration of RE in record time. Another thing is natural gas as a transition fuel. This is quite important to Ghana because now we have a high percentage of natural gas being used in thermal generation. And the energy that jeopardizes this position because we are currently unable to pay for the gas that we are purchasing. And this will definitely affect financial viability and the ability to progress with gas as a transition fuel if it continues over time. The debts also affect investment attraction to the gas sector. And this is necessary because we need to be able to explore and exploit and expand infrastructure to be able to promote gas. And this brings us to what Ghana can do currently to be able to foster energy transition in light of the overhang of the energy debt. And one key thing will be to pay as much or even more attention to debt accumulation as to debt restructuring. And this is something that personally I've been sharing from the beginning of since we started discussing the energy debt, that it is better to look at the factors critically that are causing the debt accumulation and do the solution from there, because once we are still accumulating debt, and even now we're accumulating the debt faster, it sort of defeats the purpose of the debt restructuring. So it's a key thing that we need to look at in Ghana, and we need to settle existing debt more sustainably. There's a cash waterfall mechanism that is being adopted now. However, there are still some complaints about it, so it's something that needs to be looked at. And a key thing will be to avoid diverting funds from servicing the energy debt towards other uses because it defeats the purpose. And concerning energy transition, as has been said already, financing is the most important issue for implementing all the plans, the NDCs, the energy transition framework, all of that. So financing needs to be looked at. And there are deeper public financial management issues in Ghana in general, which need to be resolved to be able to yield resources to fund all these transition plans. And yes, it's good to explore external funding sources, but we need to also build investor confidence by resolving our debt issues, our energy debt issues. And it will be key to develop sustainable and pragmatic financing strategies. This will be actual strategy documents which would help in the delivery of energy transition planning to foster actionable implementation. And of course, this plan must take into consideration actions that deal with the debt. Yes, these are a number of financing options that we might look at. Of course, there's no perfect solution, but definitely we can look at climate financing mechanisms. We can look at private finance. We can look at, of course, into our national budget, assuming we are able to deal with public financial management issues, and the taxes and other financing and physical instruments. Thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Barbara. That was a wonderful presentation. And my key takeaway from this presentation has to do that Ghana has a huge debt, and some of the challenges facing Ghana includes the excess gas supply and overgeneration of power. And then also the unresolved debt to gas purchases actually affects natural gas as a transition fuel. And some solution you've proposed includes we paying more attention to our debt accumulation as against debt restructuring. So we need to look at the debt accumulation more and see how come we accumulate such a huge debt in the energy sector as against we trying to restructure the whole debt system. And then also we should try and avoid diverting funds into servicing other sectors of the economy. If we are putting money into the ESLA funds to be able to feed off the debt in the energy sector, so should it be. We shouldn't put our hands into the coffers of the ESLA bonds or the CWM for other needs aside what it was assigned for. Thank you very much. We actually have some questions in the Q&A, but we'll bring those questions out during the Q&A section, and then we'll be able to have a panel discussion in that regard. Thank you very much, Barbara, for this wonderful speech. Thank you too. Our second speaker will be Mr. William Ampoma. Mr. William Ampoma will be speaking on the energy future and the path to net zero CO2 emission. Mr. Ampoma, do you have any presentation to share with us? And if you do, please go ahead and share your presentation. I'm actually very much interested in your topic because energy future and the path to net zero CO2 emission is very important, especially with regards to the SDG goals of we trying to eliminate CO2 emissions. Please, the floor is yours, Professor William Ampoma.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation. Let me turn on my video quick. Okay. Yeah, thanks so much for the introduction and also putting this great program together. I did really enjoy the impact of the debt on energy transition. So a quick, let me see here. You know, this is the first time I've joined a platform on of the SPE, especially on some of these webinars. You know, and I'm also a product from KNUST, and I've had a lot of interaction with most of the team from SPE Ghana. You know, I am a commissioner here in the state of New Mexico, appointed by the Energy Secretary to the Oil Conservation Commission, and also a professor here at New Mexico Tech as well. The outline of my presentation, I'll talk about what do we mean when we say net zero. And then why is it so important? And where do we stand? How do we achieve the net zero? And I'll give you some lessons from the US as to what the government is actually doing. You know, just to show you that I've had experience, a lot of extensive experience in carbon storage research projects here in the US, and also trying to work with KNUST and UNR on this kind of path as well. Now, what do we mean when we say net zero? You know, we need to be able to reduce or more or less remove the CO2 from all sectors, you know, and nations. And then added them up, it has to be zero globally. Now, the scale matters. One person, or let's say one industry, city or state can accomplish this, but is it feasible in terms of, let's say, the entire world simultaneously? Timing also matters. As we all know, our leaders get together from time to time to come up with climate goals. And the one that is really popular that we are all looking up to is the Paris Accord, which is saying that by 2050, we should reduce our emissions by 40%. And yet, we still have that 1.5 degree change as well. So 100% is actually 100% reduction in the emissions is actually required to really further minimize the impact. So what does that mean? Time is actually running out on us. So why is net zero important? If you look at pre-industrialized years, that is around, let's say 1900, our emissions was around about 2 billion tons of CO2 per year. Now we are looking at, from 2020, as of 2020, we are looking at about 33 billion tons of CO2 per year that we emit into the atmosphere. And as I said previously, there has been a lot of talks, with regards to our leaders trying to see how we can reduce our emissions. And emissions, with regards to, let's say, climate issues, I'm sure that we are all aware of some of the impacts that is having on our environment. And some of these are unpredictable, and the consequences are really great on our planet. So definitely we all agree, as oil and gas folks, we all agree that something needs to be done. But the question is, how do we do it? So if you look at the Paris Accord, from the 1900s, you see that the emissions start building up. And right here at 2020, we are right here at 33 gigatons of CO2 per year that is being emitted into the atmosphere. Now, with regards to the Paris Accord, we have to reduce that to about 13 gigatons. But still, the impact on the climate is not going to go away. So what is the goal? We have to get to zero. Now, how do we do that? Let's say, in fact, where are we now? Where are we now? Now, if you look at US, for example, US is really going down. So US is projected to reduce emissions by 35% in the next 30 years. More or less to about 4.4 gigatons of CO2 emissions per year. That is good though, but it's still not enough. Now, why am I saying that? If you look at the rest of the world, China is right there up there, right? Europe too is doing great, going down massively. India and China, they are still building new coal power plants, right? So it's not going to be easy, for us to say that, we are going to more or less achieve this goal without more like a global effort. So in terms of what is happening around the world, it's not that easy. Emissions, from China is really going up. United States is going down. Europe is going down. India is going up. All the other countries too, you'll see that is more or less stabilizing. And even if you look at Africa, we are mostly on the path of industrialization now. So our emissions are going to grow over the years. Now, we really need to be able to drop this in terms of the emissions significantly to be able to even meet the Paris Accord. And as we've been talking throughout the morning, we all know that the hydrocarbon is just an unfortunate reality. We are going to live with it. So like Prof was saying earlier on, it is probably not going anywhere. So if you look at the map, the chart that I'm showing on the right-hand side, by 2050, we are more or less on a broader adoption of renewables, but we'll still have the 60% of world energy that will still come from hydrocarbons. And it's similar to the coal or oil, let's say natural gas in 30 years, as we have today. It's still going to be the same. But hydrocarbon energy emits CO2, as we all know, in our industry, we all know that. For us, in the most of us in the carbon storage research, or let's say in carbon management research, we do believe that the carbon storage is going to be one of the best approach for us to be able to more or less meet some of these climate goals. So how do we achieve the net zero? Let's talk about the immense challenges that we are facing right now. Now, if you look at hydrocarbon energy, coal power plants, in some countries, like I said, they are building new coal power plants. In the US, coal power plants, some of them are shutting down. It contributes to about 30% of the world's entire CO2 emissions. You have natural gas plants, about 22%. And then the cars that we drive is about 9%. Also, some of the critical building materials like cement, steel, these are all contributing to, let's say, the emissions that we are contributing to, like the 33 gigatons of CO2 that we are more or less emitting into the atmosphere. Now, before we can really meet this demand with regards to, let's say, getting to more renewables, we need we still need some additional items to be able to get us there, right? So we're still going to contribute to the emissions. While rapidly evolving, technology may not answer all these questions in time that we have left to meet the Paris Accord goals. And I know we do have folks that are going to talk about more like critical minerals and all of that. So I will skip through some of my presentations quickly. But if you look at renewables, and in the US, you see that it's more like political divide, right? You have people talking about, oh, let's go for renewables, let's go for renewables. But we don't really talk about the items that we need to be able to get to that, to build those renewable type of energy. If you look at a wind tower material, for example, it includes like more than, let's say, 71% to 95% steel and iron by mass. It's also contributing to emissions. The fiberglass, concrete, copper, everything is all contributing to the emissions. So it's not like renewable is more or less clean, right? We need to really understand all of that. So likely need to mitigate rather than eliminating these emissions. So if you look at the goals, Ghana goals, they are looking at more like adaptation, right? As the first point. So we have to mitigate rather than more like trying to eliminate all these emissions, because even if you are going for renewables, you are still going to be able, you are still utilizing materials that also contributes to more or less the total emissions as well. And not even talk about, let's say, the strategic minerals. In the US, we have over 285 million vehicles in the US today. Now, if we want to electrify all of these vehicles, you're going to look at more like 4 years of world annual production of copper right now, 8 years of lithium, 15 years of cobalt production right now. So it's not that easy. And this is only US, right? So you can also think about other countries also, and industries also need these materials. So we are not going to be able to jump in and say that we are going to go to net zero right now. It's just not going to happen. And even aside all of these materials that are in scarcity right now, the geopolitics and then also the social cost is so enormous. In the US, we talk about, let's say, getting lithium batteries and all these material, rare earth elements, all of these coming together to build the renewable power and all of that. But we also need to understand where they are coming from and the power that these people or these countries also, the power that they have in controlling what really happens. So you talk about China, you talk about Russia, you talk about even where are we mining these minerals, for example. In some places there is a child labor, and also even some countries are using these minerals as more like a political war power. So definitely, it's not going to be really easy for us. Renewables, hydrogen, associated new infrastructure, all needs more strategic minerals than are mined today. This means many new mines are needed. So the question is, how do we get to net zero? Now, we all understand that switching completely to renewables is a multi-generational change. And we only have a generation to accomplish this. We need to have more advanced technologies in energy storage, grid management, and power electronics, and also huge infrastructure. If you are looking at the entire US to go more or less straight away to, let's say, renewables, for example, solar energy. For most of us, for those of you who more or less know the demography of the US, you're looking at the state of New Mexico and then Arizona needs to be covered with the entire solar panels before we can generate enough power, to offset what is coming from our hydrocarbon resources. Now, we need to rapidly develop new sources of strategic minerals and alternative technology to use these common materials. Now, will need to be able to use existing energy sources. And that is what we from petroleum engineering, or let's say from SPE, that is what we are preaching, that we have to have that energy mix where we are more or less gradually reducing the reliance on fossil fuel, replacing that with renewables, but it's not going to be done overnight. It's still going to be with us for a very, very, very long time. So the mitigation, for us is something that we are championing. What do we do to really reduce our emissions and not necessarily trying to offset everything overnight? Now, for us as petroleum engineers, we do have that expertise to be able, for governments, or let's say for the world to leverage on that when you talk about our subsurface experience and also the trained workforce to be able to mitigate, these emissions. Now, we need to be able to give more like credits, for companies to have some motivation to more or less decarbonize, and also penalties work pretty well. So we talked earlier on presentation, Ghana wants to reduce emissions. Now, if you come to the US, it is more or less in the state of New Mexico. As a commissioner, when I sit on some of these boards, we've banned methane emissions. You cannot flare any methane in the state of New Mexico, right? So once it comes to that, you see that that is a penalty that sticks, right? But at the same time, you give incentives to companies that are trying to help meet some of these reduction in emission goals. So is there a path to net zero? That is a question that we've been asking ourselves for a very, very long time. Locally is yes. Communities, cities, states, and even countries could do that with a healthy mix of increased efficiency, use all types of decarbonized powers depending on local needs, and also carbon capture and storage from fixed emission sources. Direct air capture has been a big one now. In the US, we're really pushing through that, but it is a really expensive venture, but definitely it can be done. So as I said, the cost is a really big issue. So if you look at all of these, you will see that probably carbon capture is going to be more like the big one, and also having a healthy energy mix to be able to reduce this. Now, this cannot work when it comes to, let's say, the global commodities. It is really expensive. The West cannot necessarily come to Africa and tell us what to do in terms of, hey, you have to go straight away to renewables or more or less transition, have zero emissions. It's not going to work. So globally, there is not a clear path right now. There is no one that is present right now. Most countries cannot afford these kind of technologies that we talk about. The first presentation clearly talks about, the current state of Ghana and where Ghana is right now. So it's not easy for Ghana to jump on and say that we are going net zero. It is really, really expensive. But the carbon capture and storage from fixed emission sources is going to be the cheapest. And as we continue to do the research, you see that the cost is going to come down. But if you look at globally, as we're trying to do it globally, you are not going to be able to tell countries what to do. Like I said, India is still building new coal power plants. So how are you going to tell them to really stop the industrialization in hope to more or less mitigate CO2 emissions? It's not going to happen. So developing countries cannot be handicapped, in terms of economically. We need all these energy sources to move forward, right? So every country is going to go forward with its own first world problem, right? So hydrocarbons are very cost effective and will only become more so as some countries in the region stop using them. And it's not going to happen, right? It's not going to happen. But every country should be able to at least look at what they can do, like Ghana is doing right now, trying to look at the path, what they can do in the short term and then also in the long term. So that brings me to CCUS. Even though this technology is a little bit expensive, but that is more assured way for us to be able to meet some of these goals. The deal here is that we cannot offset the emissions by getting more or less rapidly moving away from fossil fuel. It's not going to happen. So we can capture the CO2, or let's say we can capture the GHG emissions that we are more or less emitting from coal, natural gas, cement, steel, fertilizer plants, and many others. And we can also utilize the CO2 that we are capturing for enhanced oil recovery to add value. And this has been something that is going on in the US for a very long time, where they capture the CO2 and use that as more or less for enhanced oil recovery to improve our production. And also the storage in deep aquifers. For us petroleum engineers, or let's say SPE, we have that knowledge base. In the US, we do know where we can store CO2 successfully and then be able to monitor the CO2 based on the experience that we've had with regards to enhanced oil recovery. And let me push on forward and say that these existing mature technologies, are usable. So enhanced oil recovery in the US have been utilized for over 5 decades, mostly in the US and then also in Canada. And I'll show you some few slides showing you that the US government is spending over 43 billion in the next decade trying to reduce emissions. And if you look at the petroleum engineering sector, we do have all the expertise. We do have the subsurface expertise. We do know how to control, how to build pipelines, how to operate pipelines, compressors, in-mine solutions for the conversion of the capture of the CO2. So if you look at the CCUS, all the infrastructure too is present. And also we do have a workforce that is ready, more or less from the oil and gas sector, to be able to deploy these technology today. And that, based on our research or based on what we know, that is mostly the surest way, in terms of the short term, for us to meet some of these emission goals. So let me give you a little bit about what the US government is doing. The US government is really pushing a huge amount of money towards carbon storage research. And I lead one of them. That is a big one, about $23 million project where we are capturing CO2 from a hydrogen production facility and then trying to store that in an underground. They're looking at point source where they capture directly from, let's say, a particular source, a particular CO2 emission source, and then they try to store that. And also the direct air capture, there's been a huge investment to be able to utilize direct air capture to reduce emissions, and also building some huge pipeline infrastructure in the US to be able to take some of these CO2 and connect them from the source to the sink. And they are heavily, investing over 20 to 40 facilities. And it's all capturing CO2 and then storing that CO2 underground. And I'm sure most of you have heard about the UIC underground injection control class 6 well, where the US government is really putting a lot of resources. We start from the pre-feasibility studies, where we are able to gather information, about a particular basin to see how we can understand the subsurface. And then also we go forward to drill actual characterization wells to be able to get actual data to support whatever we've done in the pre-feasibility stage. And then we go into actually putting in a class 6 permit, a UIC class 6 permit, to be able to more or less for EPA, in the US, it's the same as in Ghana, right? To be able to get a permit, to get the authority to inject CO2 in the underground. And the government, after you get that UIC permit, the government is going to support over 40 projects, where they are all going to go in there and capture CO2 from point sources and then store that in subsurface. And this is all going to be utilized based on the petroleum engineering expertise. So the workforce is really ready. So if you look at the US, it's more combined. They are trying to bring in renewables at the same time, trying to mitigate whatever is there right now. So some of what I'm showing here is some of the projects that the government is really supporting right now. And it's been a huge investment. Definitely some countries might not have this infrastructure, might not have this kind of financial bandwidth to do that. But at least the technologies that we are generating, that we are developing in the US, for example, could be applicable in other countries such as Ghana as well. So I am going to wrap it up and say that what are the key takeaways? You know, the world needs hydrocarbons to support renewable growth, like plastics, lubricants, and also road building. The world also needs abundant energy, and hydrocarbons will fill this need for the decade to come. You know, there's no projected, if you come to the US, there's no projected change to hydrocarbon use, you know, by 2050. We don't see that here. You know, this is what most countries can afford, you know, to fuel their development. So it's still part of us. Now, with regards to the decarbonization of hydrocarbon, you know, using existing technologies today, that is what I talked about. That is in terms of the carbon utilization for enhanced oil recovery, cement, manufacturing plastic as well. And also using CO2 storage to mitigate the emissions. And also the lowest cost of entry, that is the lowest cost of entry to actually reach this climate goals. So I'm going to end here, and hopefully we'll have the chance to answer any questions as the program progresses. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Professor William Ampoma, on that topic on energy future and the path to net zero CO2 emissions. I think this is very, very important because as we can see from your presentation, you made mention of industrialization, where China and India are still using coal, and Europe, America, they've already used coal before to actually develop their country. And China, India is doing that. So for us as Africa, do we need to follow the trends of China and India by industrializing our countries, by using this fossil fuels as against we trying to curb the fossil fuel? Thank you very much for your presentation. It was thought-provoking, and I'm sure we have a lot of questions in the chat box, and we'll be able to ask you these questions during the panel discussion. Thank you very much once again. So ladies and gentlemen, our third speaker for today will be Dr. Teo Acheampong. He's an economics and political risk consultant in the UK. And today he will be discussing energy transition, critical minerals and resources-based industrialization. Mr. Dr. Teo Acheampong, please, if you're ready with your slide, you can share your slides with us as you take on your presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, sir, we can see your screen.
Okay, all right, brilliant. And as always, it's a great pleasure to be here. I think a number of the points that I wanted to make have actually already been made, some by Prof. Wumi in his earlier remarks, but also by William as well in the talk that he just gave a few moments ago in that regard. But I just want to take the conversation further from where they left off. William was talking about the need for all these different mineral resources to power the transition. And the question really is that, what does that mean for Africa as a whole, given that we do have quite a number of these, mineral resources. But to answer that, of course, one needs to understand, what is a transition at all. And I think our earlier speakers have given a good background to what the transition is. So I'll kind of skip over a few of those materials that I prepared, and then I'll go in to talk a little bit more about the critical minerals bit. But I think for me, the starting point always is that we need to put things into a historical context, right? So we have always had waves of movements or waves of industrialization across the development of humanity. And you can go all the way back to, the 16th, 17th century, when steam and water, you name it, came. And then eventually now we're in another wave where we're talking about, the use of cleaner technologies to sort of power our economies going forward. And in all of these historical waves, there's always a cost that is associated. And for me, as you know, as an economist, it's a question of who bears that cost, and how do you spread it in a way that you minimize or rather maximize the welfare gains across different societies. We've heard about the transition, and it's been talked about by our earlier speakers, but in a very kind of simple way, I like to tell the story with a chart. We are seeing a radical shift, right, from what we are used to, or the energy forms that we're used to, into newer forms of energy use and energy production, which one reduces the carbon impact or footprint, but allows us to all live, more sustainably. For us to actually meet these requirements of the future, particularly in the next 30 years, you need a lot of mineral resources to be able to do that. And it's a question of where does that come from? Again, just to paint a little picture in terms of context, we are talking about, halving the time. So it took, if you just go back to the last, century, it took about 75 years for oil to gradually rise to the top and become king. And in the mid 70s, oil as a share of the total global primary energy mix was king. And of course, that was at the expense of coal. And it's been gradually coming down a bit. But what basically this new form of transition we're talking about is that instead of taking 75 years for oil to become, that it took for oil to become king, in the case of renewables, we're looking at doing that within half of the time. So doing that within 30 years. And that is actually quite a rapid ramp up. And that again comes with, serious consequences. The reason really being that for a number of our countries where we come from in Africa, it's being made or being presented as a binary development choice. You either go this path or you forgo even the investment opportunities that comes with it. And when Prof. Uri was talking about earlier, he used the analogy of the energy trilemma to explain the different sort of policy choices that are facing African countries. So globally, yes, there's this push for decarbonization and net zero, you name it. But then locally within our countries as well, we know that we have big issues with energy access and equity, and the need to sort of leverage our resource endowments for the development of our people. So you can actually see these big contestations in terms of how the issue is being framed at a global level, and then of course how it is being also framed at a local level. I think a couple of years ago, there was an interesting article written in the Foreign Affairs magazine by the former vice president, or still vice president of Nigeria. They haven't handed over yet. Basically that all the attempts to curb particularly natural gas investments coming into regions like Africa is not just a question of limiting CO2 emissions, but it's going to hurt the continent's economic, prospects. So that is how this has been more or less been framed. The issue is that if the net zero goals are to be met, this 1.5 degree that William talked about, then according to some of the modeling and the estimates, in Africa, almost half of the oil resources on the continent, in fact, reserves, not even resources, would be unextractable. You cannot get it out of the ground. Globally, we need to leave as much as 60%, right, of the oil reserves on the ground if we are to meet this, net zero goals. And that's challenging because for many countries and many economies, this is really what powers their energy, and this is what powers their industrial development as well. But that's one side of the story. The other side of the story is really the opportunities that this presents in terms of the new minerals that are needed to power that transition in that sense. So we're here, or there's been a lot of talk these days in mainstream media and the literature about critical minerals, but in a very broad sense, what makes them really critical is that you need them to power the new industrial revolution, but also it becomes critical in terms of where you source them for. So there are possible supply chain issues that we need to take into account. And if we have to meet the goals or the net zero goals, we need far more of these minerals, 6 times more than we currently need to be able to meet, right, those goals. So again, I like to give numbers. If you take a normal car, right, compare that to a typical electric car. For a normal car, you normally have about 2 metals, right, within that. For a typical electric car, you've got about 7 or so different metals within that. And that, in terms of quantities, you're talking 200 kilograms for an EV, as compared to about 40 kilograms of 2 metals for your conventional one. So you need a lot of these new minerals to be able to power the new industrial development that is required going forward. And coupled with that, a number of countries have already put in targets to sort of ban some of the internal combustion engines, because transportation is one of the biggest, sectors where a lot of these, emissions come from. But this is where the opportunity comes for countries in Africa in terms of where these minerals are and how we can exploit them optimally to power our development, going forward. Mining is not new in Africa. And personally for me, in the last 2-3 years, a lot of my work that I've been doing within the consulting space is really about helping countries and helping sort of investors optimize the opportunities that this new mineral boom is presenting in that sense. And this boom, you can see it in a number of ways, because we just don't have enough of the mineral resources. Let me reframe it this way. The issue is not about the resource or the mineral reserves. It's a question of how fast you can actually get it out of the ground. And we've done a number of studies, one of which I actually participated in. And if you look, I just use copper here as an example to show you. In the case of copper, if we're to meet net zero goals, right, the gray bar here, we basically are going to have a massive supply deficit of copper in the next couple of years. The reason is because not enough mines are being sanctioned to come onto the market. And what that then ultimately means is that prices are going to go up for a number of these minerals. And this is a forecast from the IMF of the different mineral resources But I think that's where really the opportunity is for a number of our countries. Problem is that historically, again, we've been the least diversified, and we remain highly vulnerable to a lot of these, external shocks. So there is an opportunity for us to play this game and play it to our advantage as Africa and as Africans. But to do that, it's a question of how you participate in the value chain, and it's a question of how you're able to now leverage these resources to move or to create more products, goods, services, jobs out of that. Because as we speak currently, again, if you look at our manufacturing value add, it's one of the least globally, but this can be turned around. And that's where I want to sort of end on with a few ideas around how that can be done. This is coming from a chapter in a book that I just wrote, but I basically, the three proposals that I am making, some of them are not exactly new per se, but it's really a question of how we frame it and how we use that. And you will see, if you go back to the history of economic development in Africa, particularly in the post-colonial days, your 60s and 70s, you see various forms of this beginning to take shape. So for example, under President Nkrumah with the Volta River, project, but they were not able to sustain them for a number of reasons. So there are three proposals that sort of I want to talk about and wrap up. The first one is how we can shift the production factors into some of the areas around green industrialization. The second one, which both Prof and William have talked about, is for me, look, it's the key thing is energy access and security. And for that, as a continent, we need to use all the available energy resources at our disposal to be able to do that. And then the third one is really the value chain imperatives with the critical, minerals as well. The two key things I want to talk about here, it's a bit of a busy slide, but the key thing here is about strategy, industrial policy. Interestingly, if you follow the news in the last few months, there's a lot of the fragmentation happening geopolitically, but at the core of this fragmentation, whether it's US, EU on one side and China and Russia on the other, it's a question of control of various, resources, and how countries are able to do that, or the big economies do that, is through the use of industrial policy. We've had in the US the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed, and at one point, if you need to manufacture EVs, you need to have about 40% of the components coming in from countries or jurisdictions that America has a free trade, agreement with. I think for us as a continent, we can also play a bit of this game. But for us, in addition to the industrial policy, it's also how we can be able to offer some of the targeted incentives to support companies to actually come in and set up, the plants that can convert these copper and lithium, cobalt, etc., into midstream components, and eventually for the use of the assembly facilities. After all, we do offer big tax incentives to the traditional mining companies or the oil and gas companies that come in. We can equally offer that those tools as a means of catalyzing broad-based industrial development. But the key is industrial policy. The second thing about the meeting of the needs using all the energy resources, it's been talked about a lot, but again, I want to reiterate the point. We have huge resources and we must use all those resources at our disposal to meet our energy needs. So for example, when Barbara was speaking, she talked about the Ghana Energy Transition Plan. One of the components in that plan is actually nuclear energy, and to be able to get some modular reactors within that. But the bit that I think there are also opportunities really is with the renewable side of it. And let's not just think of it as just a question of an energy game, but really it's a question of an economic development game where we're thinking about it as an ecosystem with different facets and different linkages within that sphere. And then, I mean, the last one is in terms of the deepening of the linkages, it comes back to how we can pursue beneficiation to our own gain. And so everywhere on the continent, you'll find one of these minerals that are needed for the transition. It's all over the place. But in order for us not to be caught once again in this resource curse or the paradox of plenty, the narrative has got to change. And I'm happy to see a bit of that happening now. So for example, Zambia and Namibia, Botswana, and even Angola are talking about a new sort of industrial corridor. Same thing with Zambia and DRC, which produces, a lot of the world's copper, where they're talking about getting the companies to add value to the copper and the cobalt, and even imposing some form of export bans before you can move that mineral resource, out of the ground. But this is really, for me, the game changer. And the game changer being the idea that we need to stop thinking countries, we need to stop thinking silos, and rather approach it from a sort of more pan-African or pan-regional approach, leveraging the power of the Continental Free Trade Agreement and area in that regard. So basically, that's the little story that I wanted to tell, but it comes down to strategy, specifically industrial policy. It comes down to the ability to leverage the Continental Free Trade area, and then it comes down to the ability to reduce some of the structural bottlenecks and ultimately where the money comes from to be able to do that going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tio Achampon. That was a great presentation, and key words or keynotes that I took personally was that critical minerals such as copper, lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements are actually essential components in many of today's rapidly growing clean energy technologies we can find. And therefore, as Africa, we also need to look at a paradigm shift in this renewable energy by actually utilizing the hydrocarbons that we actually have in abundance in Africa. Therefore, moving on to the path of industrialization, just like the Europeans and the Americans have done by actually utilizing the hydrocarbons in their country. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm very sure we have lots of questions for you, and we'll get back to you during the panel discussion. Thank you very much, Dr. Tio. Ladies and gentlemen, the next panelist will be Dr. Jin Song Sung. He is a research professor at Hankook University of Foreign Studies. And today he will be speaking on the role of hydrogen in gas transition, energy market response to energy transition. Dr. Jinson Sung, if you're ready, you can share your presentation with us and take over from here. Thank you very much.
Yes, first of all, I would like to thank the organizer for the invitation to this prestigious event. I'm very honored to have an opportunity to share my experience and research result with you. And I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to speak with you and discuss this very important topic with our colleagues in SPE Ghana section. I'm based in Seoul in South Korea and have been conducting research on hydrogen and policies and the role of hydrogen in energy policies in the Asia Pacific region, with a focus on the Asia Pacific region. And of course, the situation is quite different in every country and every region. But I believe there are common aspects where we can share our experience and share our and also share experience and knowledge. And of course, I hope my presentation can be at least a little bit useful or can be interesting to participants in this our technical workshop. Oh, sorry. Do I have to? Yeah. And I've been my presentation will have consists of two parts. First, the role of hydrogen gas in energy transition, which is the title of my presentation, and also the second part I will focus on the research result which I have drawn from South Korea's experience in developing hydrogen strategy and how what kind of role hydrogen can play in the energy transition and economic policies. I have, of course, it's many of the aspects of hydrogen is quite well known, but if I repeat that, I'm a little critical to hydrogen. I hope I would like to ask for your understanding, especially in our country, in South Korea. Yes, there's a lot of challenges to overcome, and I believe that hydrogen is a little less effective and less calorific, but more expensive. And in order to achieve goals set by Asian government or Korean government here, that technically the hydrogen has to a long ways to go to reach that level. And then after discussing the hydrogen with experts in South Korea, that hydrogen has the best aspect as best potential as energy storage, which because hydrogen can store a large amount of electricity generated by renewable energy. Climate goal, in my opinion, set in South Korea, in many other Asian countries, is very ambitious and very challenging to achieve it, and especially with renewables and coal to gas switch. So role of hydrogen has been extended, or role of other alternative fuels were introduced to achieve such high climate target, NDC target set by many governments in Asia Pacific region, so role of hydrogen in the energy transition with a focus in this region. Yes, local. Of course, the hydrogen technically can be produced in every country and everywhere in the world, and it also exists in the atmosphere. And local production hydrogen is technically possible. But is it really a huge contributing factor to enhancing national security? Because South Korea and Japan have over 95% of reliance on imported energy. Almost nothing is produced here. So hydrogen and renewable energy was expected to play an important role to increase the the share of locally produced energy resources. But the research results shows that production of hydrogen is very expensive in comparison with its imports, which I will expand a little later. And also role of, but due to this, the advantage of possibility of locally producing the energy, that role of hydrogen has been strengthened in many different outlooks. So I'm not going to go into all the details, so I have a limited of time. And the role of renewable also has been increased due not only to meet a climate target in the energy mix, but also as it has advantages of also locally producing how to say, electricity. So the other result that, but in order to achieve these goals, that a lot of companies and governments here have to deal with the cost, high cost, and technology challenges to become an important part of our energy system. So if I move to next slides, yes, oh, please, well, it's not moving. Sorry. Okay, yeah. I believe that that climate target is bit inflated in some countries in this region and Asia Pacific region. And if we look at the NDC target of a Paris Agreement is constantly being increased, but I have a doubt that it has have gone through that enough examination or feasibility to achieve this goal. So the weather, but if you look at the renewables is much better, but if you look at the tempo of the technical development of hydrogen-related technology, so far we do, that the technology is not ready. And in order to meet this hydrogen consumption target, the development of hydrogen-related technology has to be fast enough to meet climate goals. We need it, whether it's possible or not, it remains to be seen. So another concern is maybe it is possible to meet the climate goals by using more hydrogen and renewables, but it will be at the expense of competitiveness of main industries in the region, because the regional economy is heavily dependent on the industry, which consumes a lot of energy, like high energy density industries such as steel industry, IT, or ship manufacturing and petrochemical industry, which consumes a huge amount of energy. But the small increase in energy costs will result in the decrease at the, how do you say, that the loss of price competitiveness of local industry. But if you use hydrogen, it's not a small increase in price, but a lot of high increase of additional cost. It's one of the main worries of people in the industry and energy sector in South Korea. And some people think that many people have a reservation whether it's possible or not. So the role of hydrogen economy in South Korea and the main goals and main drivers of developing a hydrogen economy is first of economic development by developing a new industry, which is hydrogen-related industry, H2 vehicle or fuel cells increase. By developing H2 vehicle production or fuel cells products can maybe create a new industry which can contribute to the GDP growth. It was at least hope, and create more jobs, etc., etc. And also decarbonization, that the main advantage of using hydrogen instead of other gas, hydrogen, fossil fuels was emission reduction, right? And we hope to yes, because South Korea has and Japan and has a carbon neutrality target by 2050. Which is very high target, but in order to meet this target, there also no other way, just increase the share of hydrogen in the energy outlooks. Without, I think, in my opinion, without enough consideration whether it's possible or not, it was not possible to reach this carbon neutrality target outlook by using a coal to gas switch, or increasing the share of renewables in the power sector, because renewable cannot use in every industry, right? It's mostly in the power sector, and therefore the hydrogen was introduced to replace coal and gas in the industrial sector and residential sector and other sectors. But I believe that the technology is not ready yet. And also energy security, I have mentioned that diversification of energy sources is, I can understand, and increase the share of locally produced energy products and increase the share of energy imports from a project with the involvement of Korean companies. Yeah, so look at it's a hydrogen outlook of South Korea that the blue this bar graph shows the hydrogen consumption in the country. Hydrogen, yeah. If you look at these bars, hydrogen consumption only picks up, rapidly increase only after 2040. If you look at it here, it means that that the industrial participants are not so confident in the development of hydrogen technology as fast as we think. So people think it is possible the hydrogen development only fast development only possible after 2040, because as in many facts the infrastructure and also technology is not really ready. So it's a government outlook, which is normally government outlook is very optimistic, right? So in the optimistic scenario, that hydrogen consumption will only rapidly develop only after 2040. Here's another graph which shows that the share of here we can say in 2050 we have two scenarios. One is and here the 80%, 82% shows that is a share of imported hydrogen in South Korea's hydrogen mix, which means that even in 2050, while South Korea in producing hydrogen in South Korea is possible, still in optimistic government outlook that over 80% of hydrogen will be imported into South Korea energy system, which means that producing hydrogen in South Korea is really not price competitive. And means that the share of locally produced hydrogen in this region, in Asia Pacific region, will be very small because it's producing is very, very expensive. Yeah, I'm not going to look into details. The first hydrogen national hydrogen strategy was introduced in 2005, but it was not successful. So there was nothing after the 2005, and for 10 years. And the hydrogen strategy that really given a lot of attention only after 2018, which is the second wave of hydrogen strategy in South Korea. But second time was better than 2005. After 2005, there's nothing for 10 years, but when this hydrogen attention to hydrogen industry is still being on the one of the top of the agenda in Korean energy industry, and not only in Korea, I think in many other different countries. And so the main driver of pursuing the hydrogen economy was the first in 2005 net strategy was a Kyoto Protocol, because the Korea was very worried about the peak oil. Yeah, because maybe there will be not enough supply of oil, so we need to develop something else. So the option which came up with was hydrogen, but there was no peak oil, right? The oil in production is still being increased every year. And second one is the Paris Agreement. Then we in South Korea also have to respect the international agreement, and it's it's not very easy to how to say that to meet international requirement or climate policies. To catch up with this climate policy, very difficult. So so hydrogen was introduced and one of the key core plans of energy strategy. So it's one of my last slides. I will not take there's so much time. So the conclusion we have drawn was the South Korea has limited possibilities for producing clean and low carbon hydrogen domestically, because electricity produced by renewable energy, which can produce a green hydrogen, is very expensive. Electricity is expensive. The second one is the blue hydrogen, which requires a CCUS. In South Korea, is a very limited possibility of CCUS because we do not have how to say that finish the second-hand oil and gas field. And South Korea is anticipated to be a large-scale importer. So this energy security cannot be, how to say, achieved by South Korea alone. By using more hydrogen and renewable doesn't guarantee any energy security, which means that the country has to rely on the imports, and it is expected that that how do you say that cooperation with a traditional energy producer will be expected to continue. So basically, even after the acceleration of energy transition, the energy security landscape for the countries in the Asia Pacific region do not really change. So hydrogen and renewable can increase energy security a little bit, but not much more, right? So basically, I believe that fossil fuel era and renewable energy era doesn't change the fundamental picture of energy security of importing countries. And so, though what is the global hydrogen industry be? In my opinion, the major countries and companies may continue to dominate the energy market, even in the area of energy transition. And because the energy industry has entry barriers, it needs experience, it needs personnel, it needs technology, it needs experience of conducting a large-scale energy project, which so it's very important. Also, complex technologies. This technology, the hydrogen technology is very difficult. It's mostly led by German and Japanese companies, so it has entry barriers. So I believe that also most likely the existing energy exporting countries will continue to remain a core exporter. Of course, not all. Of course, there will be newcomers, successful newcomers, except the dominators in the current energy market. But majority of hydrogen exporter will be, I believe, that from this existing fossil fuel exporters. But of course, I believe that some countries have a large potential in exporting hydrogen, except the current energy exporters. This is a brief introduction of my research on the hydrogen policies in the Asia Pacific region, and I hope it can be at least a little bit useful or interesting to some of the participants in our technical workshop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jin Song Sung, research professor at Hankook University of Foreign Studies. Just before today's session, I was just scrolling through the internet to actually understand the role of hydrogen in gas in energy transition. And one thing I learned is that the hydrogen properties actually enables it to generate power and heat. And then also hydrogen can be used for power vehicles, electricity, power for industry, and even generate heat for our homes and businesses. And it could make a huge difference on our carbon emissions if we look at this critically in achieving our net zero goals. And then also countries like Canada are actually moving into that direction for hydrogen gas. And I believe it's something Africa will be looking into. But of course, we also need to look at the opportunities of exploiting or exploring our natural resources, which we have in abundance in Africa here. So until we use what we believe it's what we deserve to use for industrialization, we will not be able to go into hydrogen gas at this moment because we haven't really done much with our hydrocarbons. Thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. Sung. It was really helpful. Ladies and gentlemen, the last presenter for this panel discussion will be Dr. Rita Okoro-Afo. She will be speaking on the impact of uncertainties in CCS evaluation projects. CCS simply means carbon capture storage, and she'll be giving us a presentation on the impact of the uncertainties in evaluating projects. Dr. Okafo, please, if you're ready, please share your presentation with us. Thank you very much. Professor Rita, actually, she's not a doctor, she's a professor. So please let me correct this. Professor Rita Okoro-Afo. I hope I got the name correct, madam.
Yes, you did. Please, can you confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, please, loud and clear, Professor.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you.
Let me put this up. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone as you join in. It's a pleasure to be here. Thus far, it has been very exciting listening to all the presentations, and anyone that is here can be rest assured that they have gotten value for their time today. So I will be talking about the impact of uncertainties in CCS evaluation projects, carbon capture and storage projects. And because I believe that we are largely petroleum engineers or people in the petroleum engineering industry, in this meeting, I'll be focusing on the storage part as it relates to what we do. Key things that I'll be looking at, just talk a little bit about decarbonization pathways and where CCUS fits in, the kind of uncertainties we see, what the workflow for carbon storage is, and then I will give a case study to highlight this kind of uncertainties we see. When I talk about the impact, I'm not just going to talk about the impact, but I will talk about the management of CO2, geologic storage uncertainties, and then I will summarize. Okay, next slide. Okay, so from the talks today, we have listened to different pathways to decarbonization, and depending on what we are trying to achieve, decarbonization could consist of trying to be energy conservative, improve our efficiency, managing emissions, methane emissions flaring, afforestation, electrification of vehicles. But one very key one, which some of my speakers have alluded to, is the carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And that's what I'm going to focus on today, with key emphasis on the storage part of things. And I will highlight as most of these terms you see here as we move forward. What does the carbon capture, utilization, and storage value chain look like? It involves finding out a source that emits CO2. From that source, we find ways of capturing it, and there are different technologies for capturing the CO2. I wouldn't be expanding on that today. From there, we have to think of compressing the CO2 that we have captured. From compression, we have to transport it either for utilization or for storage. Now, storage has different technologies. It could be in the ocean, it could be in mines, it could be what we call mineralization, and then there's geologic storage in depleted oil and gas reservoirs and in saline aquifers. Now, the interest for using depleted oil and gas reservoirs and saline aquifers, that's saline reservoirs deep underground, is because of the large volume that is available to contain the CO2. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. So what's the role of carbon capture and storage in the energy transition? Now we have several sources of CO2. Not all of them are listed here, but when we are considering retrofitting existing power plants have been found out to be high emitters of CO2. And so if we retrofit them, we will be able to capture CO2 using some capture technologies. And when it's captured, we need to think of where we are going to store the CO2. And that's where CO2 storage will come in. We have other high energy intensive industries. We've heard about them: steel, cement, hydrogen production. These are high energy intensive. They also emit high concentration of CO2. And so we can capture CO2 from those sources. And when we do that, we have to think of where to store the CO2. There's also the technology of direct air capture. We've heard about it, DAC, today, where we actually capture CO2 from the air itself. When we do capture it, we need to think of where to store it. We've heard about blue hydrogen. And blue hydrogen basically is when we are generating things like hydrogen from natural gas. Natural gas is a fossil fuel. We will be generating CO2 in the process. Now, this CO2 that is generated, when we do capture it and store it, the hydrogen that is generated is referred to as blue hydrogen. There's also the possibility of combining bioenergy with carbon capture and storage called BECCS. And so this again is where CO2 storage comes in. So we see that carbon capture and storage is very key in several aspects of the energy transition. And storage is something that, like one of our speakers has alluded to, we have the expertise in the oil and gas industry to do. So we are able to handle a lot of CO2 storage. So what kind of uncertainties do we see as we go about our CCUS projects? We have geologic uncertainties when we try to think of where we're going to store, what kind of subsurface systems are we going to store in. We have the operational uncertainties and we have the market uncertainties. But today I'm going to focus on the geologic uncertainties, okay? So to put some context, when we decide that we want to store CO2 in the subsurface in a geologic system like a depleted oil and gas reservoir or a saline aquifer, we need to screen for possible sites that have the capacity, which is the volume to be able to contain the CO2. It's possible for us to inject into that system, that geologic medium. We need to ensure that we are not exceeding some certain fracture pressures that could cause leakages and losses. And we have to ensure that we are able to contain the CO2. When we have screened for possible sites that meet all these requirements, we go into selection. We ensure that there are no faults. We ensure that we are not going against some environmental and economic constraints, and that our existing wells are not sources of leakages. When we have identified the sites where we want to store CO2, we then need to go through the process of permitting, ensuring that we have the permits to drill, to inject into such areas. We have properly designed the wells. One of our speakers mentioned the Class 6 wells, and ensure we have sufficient strategies for what we want to do when we want to stop injection, so CO2 well abandonment. And while we inject the CO2, we need to ensure we know what's happening with the CO2, and there are different ways for which we monitor the CO2 in the subsurface, okay? So when we want to do our site screening and ranking, the site screening, it involves looking at several sites, and we try to eliminate which ones will not meet our minimum criteria. For instance, we would like our CO2 to be in what we call a supercritical state, where it has high density and low viscosity, which will enable us to inject the CO2 and keep and maximize the space we have in the subsurface to store. And to do that, we use publicly available data. We can use, just general data to give us some idea of the screening. However, when we want to do site ranking, which is we have sites that have passed our site screening, we then go into the stage of looking in detail of, in addition to the public data, we want to go into specific data for fields. So we want to look at pressures, permeabilities, porosities, well survey data, field history to know if those sites are very good or good enough for us to store CO2. After we've ranked our sites and we've identified which ones are good enough, we need to characterize them. And one of our speakers alluded to that, where we gather more information about those reservoirs to understand if indeed they are good enough for our CO2 storage. This could involve pilot tests, lab experiments, modeling studies, and further acquisition and processing of seismic data. Now, in a study that we did, we looked at the impact of different reservoir properties on our CO2 storage capacity. And here I have what we call a tornado plot. What we see is that parameters like the porosity, the reservoir pressure, the depth of our reservoir, and the area of our reservoir has significant impact on the storage capacity. So which means that, for instance, if I have a high porosity reservoir, I should be able to store more. If my reservoir pressure is high, I'm able to compress my CO2 more and keep it in the subsurface. And if I have a very small area, for instance, I may not be able to contain enough CO2, okay? So these are some of the things that we look at, and it tells us that these are parameters that can lead to uncertainties. If we are not sure of what our porosity is, for instance, or our reservoir pressure, we may not be able to identify what are the best sites for CO2 storage. So I'm going to talk about a case study that was done. I don't list the field names, but these are the field properties. And normally, when we look at certain fields, we have high-low estimates because of the uncertainties that are inherent in the data themselves. So in terms of the volume or that was available to for CO2 for each of the fields, we have a high estimate and a low estimate. We have the depth of the formation, which is the depth of the reservoir. We usually want our reservoirs to be from 800 meters and below, because at that point, CO2 is critical, is at the supercritical condition. We look at the permeabilities, our high and our low estimates, so low, high estimate. In some cases, we may not have all this. If it might just be that we have similar values for the low and high, and the uncertainty is less. Porosity, we have ranges. Reservoir thicknesses, we have ranges. But for this study, when we did it, we assumed that we would take the average. And then based on the average, and we did our site screening and ranking, this was how all these fields came out, okay? We identified field A as the best and field J as the worst in terms of storage. Now, when we bring in the uncertainties, when we take the low estimates, for instance, into our study, we found out that field A was no longer our best. It ranked 7th place in terms of how good it was going to be for CO2 storage. Again, by the time we brought in high estimates, it was 6. So it means that what it means is that with the uncertainty that we have in our data, we could also have uncertainties in the way we rank our fields. And then if we have chosen field A as our best reservoir to store CO2, we could later come back and find out that it was actually not the best, because by the time we go in, perhaps the low estimate of the thickness is impacting the volumes we're able to inject, or in another case, it could well be that the porosity or the low permeability, for instance, this one that was 4, due to low permeability, became ranked number 8. So we see that with uncertainties, with the kind of data that we have, we may not be able to identify, we may have uncertainties in the choice of which reservoirs are going to be suitable for CO2 storage. So what are the impact of the geologic uncertainties? What we've seen so far is that if we do not take into account our uncertainties, we may come up with improper screening and site selection. We may assume that we know what the size of our reservoir is, but by the time we start injecting the CO2, we may not be able to store sufficient amount of CO2. And this is what many of the projects to date are beginning to see, because we have been using deterministic estimates. Again, this will result in increased cost of the project, because you would have to consider another site to store the volumes of CO2 that you initially wanted to. And then again, the investors are the ones that are providing most of the financing for CO2 projects, which are quite finance intensive. And so when we are unable to minimize the uncertainties in our project, it has impacts on our investor confidence, including our project financing. So how can we manage our uncertainties? And this is looking even towards us as in Africa. Why I say this is because as I got involved in this project, a very key thing was having access to accurate and complete data. And so if we're able to manage our data collection processes early on, curate this data, prepare it into a form that will be suitable for CO2 storage studies, proper archiving of the data, and in some cases, if applicable, making them accessible to people that are doing research or people that are doing studies, it's going to really help. So data management is very key towards managing the uncertainties from the collection, accuracy, archiving, and curation. Now, when we want to do reservoir characterization, we have to think of what are the important data that we want to acquire. And this uncertainty study or the sensitivity analysis has shown us which data is key for us. Now, to estimate storage capacity, we don't need much information about the permeability, but we need information about the pressure of the reservoir, especially if we're going to be dealing with depleted gas reservoirs. We need information about porosity. We need information about certainty in our depth of the reservoir. Reservoir characterization is very key in managing our uncertainties, and this could involve both the data that we acquire, interpretation we do, log interpretation, etc. But in addition, lab experiments that help us to identify other things such as, what's the, what we call geomechanical properties that would prevent us from, injecting, fracturing our reservoirs as we inject CO2. And another way is continued research. We can take learnings from other projects that have been done worldwide, but the fields that we have in Africa for CO2 storage may have their own peculiarities. And so there is need to do continued research and development specifically for the kind of fields we have in Africa. So just to summarize, I would just say that, CCS technologies, as we have seen from the presentations before now, they offer significant strategic value to the pathway for decarbonization. But they come with uncertainties, and we have seen that geologic uncertainty is one of those uncertainties, which is very key. The geologic uncertainties, they have far-reaching impact. It could go from the improper site selection for CO2 projects and to reduced investor confidence. So as Africa looks towards finding a balance between energy security, affordability, and sustainability, we need to find ways of reducing our uncertainties, knowing that CCS is going to play a key role when we start thinking of maybe blue hydrogen, decarbonization of power plants, heavy industries, etc. And the ways of reducing our uncertainties will be key if we plan to harness our existing geologic resources. I want to thank all of you for your time, and I look forward to the panel and discussion session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Rita Okoro-Afo, on this great presentation. My key takeaway from the impact of CCS has to do with the carbon capture storage could be a key technology to tackle climate change. And therefore, if there is a comprehensive government policy support, it will help reduce the uncertainties in order to be able to move further with the progress of CCS. Thank you very much for that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask all the panelists to please turn on their video so that we can actually have a panel discussion. But and then before Dr. goes, before we start that, I'm going to ask Dr. the first questions, which is, how do we optimize carbon capture storage from waste to energy plants under uncertainties? That's the first question to you, Professor Rita.
So can you please repeat the question?
So the question is, how do we optimize CCS from a waste to energy plant under these uncertainties, the geographical uncertainty that you mentioned? How do we optimize the CCS?
Okay, so depending on the waste to power kind of power plant we're dealing with, it would depend on the volume and the concentration of CO2 that we are generating. And a key part of it is, once we are able to identify the way of capturing it, and we have sufficient concentration of the CO2 that is captured, then we can then think of what sites or locations are closer to that waste to power plants, for instance, where we can store the CO2. Because some of the things we take into consideration is, before we select a site to do CO2 storage, we have to think about what kind of distance are we going to have between our source to our sink to be able to store that CO2. So if it's very far, if we have sites that are very, very far, which will mean we're going to generate very long pipelines, then we may not want to consider it because the cost of building pipelines might be expensive. But if we do have closer reservoirs and storage places, then it's easier for us to optimize the workflow such that we can capture from those power plants, compress, store, transport and store to reservoirs that are close to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. So now I'm going to go to the questions chat box, and I have questions from Joseph and Daniel. I'm going to combine those questions for Prof and Barbara to answer. The first question from Joseph is that, how does Africa fund the infrastructure necessary to ensure the security of oil and gas for economic growth? And then Daniel went ahead to ask that, why is Africa not building more hydro dams so that we can actually generate more power from that side because of this affordability to the nation? So that's the question from Daniel. And the next question from Joseph, that's from Daniel. So I'd like Barbara and to please answer this question, or if anybody else wants to attempt to answer the question, because the floor is open.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Rubabat and Daniel. And the question of hydro, it's pretty interesting. Of course, I'll take it from Ghana's experience, noting that every country's experience is very contextual, but then we can look at it broad-based for Africa in general. For Ghana, we started out actually with hydro, and we were doing a good percentage of hydro in our energy mix, and power was, of course, very cheap then. But we had situations with the intermittency of rainfall, the change in the rainfall pattern, and we had to find a way to sort of evolve to be able to secure energy supply. So it was a question of energy security. And thermal for us could be quickly deployed compared to hydro. So then naturally there was a shift from hydro to thermal. I'm sure there were also some policy influences. And there are so many considerations that now need to go into going back to hydro. Again, looking at the security of supply. It's true that it could be cheaper in the long term, and I believe that, I mean, through We Power Authority and other such agencies, we have some hydro projects that will be coming online. And but I mean, thermal is more quickly deployed. That is why we have had to go the route of thermal currently. I know that hydro is always something to look into for Africa in general, and it will be good to look into investments for hydro as well, and to increase hydro within the country. I think we have deeper issues also to look at, but we can always consider that for the future.
Thank you very much for the answer. And there's another question from Emmanuel Boateng. I think it's directed at you, Barbara. Emmanuel is asking, do you also think that power theft is also one of the main causes of the debt of ECG? And what about the non-operationalization of TOR?
Yes, so power theft has been a major contributor. Unfortunately, as of now, it has not been appropriately quantified. In fact, when discussions with the power distribution utility in the northern sector of Ghana yesterday, and they complained bitterly about power theft and the fact that they are unable to even, fully trace this power theft to be able to know the exact impact of it on the death. But yes, there are reports of power theft contributing significantly to the overall debt. And yes, we've been dealing with TOR debt for a very long time. We have been paying the TOR debt recovery levy for quite a while now, but unfortunately, TOR is still not viable. In my personal opinion, there are lots of political influences that will need to be cut off for TOR to be made financially viable again. And I mean, the issue with the TOR debt levy should make us question efforts at restructuring the debt, because now we are imposing the ESLA and having all sorts of energy debt recovery levies. If we've been doing that with TOR for all this while and we've still not been able to save TOR, then we should critically think about how we are imposing levies for energy, for the recovery of the energy sector.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I think the next question goes to
Barbara.
okay, so you have something, okay.
Yeah, I mean, just gonna be very blunt. The point is that our governments just come in and impose these levies one way or the other. But the monies are not actually used for that purpose. You can trace the money and you see the money is being used for all sorts of things. So the problem which those monies are meant to solve actually are never solved, and they keep being compounded. So it's really a political problem and less so a policy issue. So we've diagnosed it, we've come up with a solution, but it's actually not been implemented. And not until we address, one of the elephants in the room here, across all of the things that we're talking about here, the politics plays a big role in all of this. If we don't get that right, we'll be dancing around in circles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tioa Champon. I think the next question will be for Prof. William Ampoma, and the question has to do with the what are the role of the infrastructure investments as part to net zero CO2 emissions?
Thanks so much for the question, Willie. Emmanuel, thanks so much for the question. Now, if you look at, as part of my presentation, I talked about the amount of investment that the US government is doing, is making about $43 billion through the infrastructure bill, and we are in the US here, we are more or less looking at, building infrastructure for the capture system, also pipeline, and then even the actual storage sites to store the CO2 that will be captured. And then even all over the US, they are building these EV charging units all over the place. Now, I will say that it all started with research, right? The government started with heavy research, looking at the infrastructure needs. How do we get there? And then also the timeline. So the same way, Ghana, depending on the path that Ghana would like to go, to meet net zero or to get to net zero, I will say that it will start with research to look at the existing infrastructure. What do we have now? What else do we need to bring on board? And then also the time frame. But it is really a huge commitment, from governments, to make this happen. And US is doing that. But in Ghana, it's going to take some time. But definitely, some work needs to be done. And it has to be done, it has to be step by step, not just jumping all the way to the end. That is what I can say on this.
Thank you very much, Professor William. Another question from Joseph Willie Amwa to you, Professor William, has to do with, his question goes thus: taking lessons from COVID-19 and how vaccine distribution went, I think it is safe to say that even if this tech is proven, it will likely not be shared freely across the globe. What does this mean for developing countries which may have geological formation to capture and store carbon, but lack the technology or the finances to do it?
Willie, I'll answer this question this way. If you look at the US, or let's say Europe, they are putting in huge amount of money towards research, right? So the first question that I would throw back to you is, what are we doing in Ghana? We do have oil companies, and in the US, oil companies support research. They get incentives for supporting research. So what are we doing in Ghana? If you look at our GDP, how much of it is related to research? In the US, we look at the problem, and the government throws in money for us to do research to solve that problem. So Ghana can can use the same model, but with regards to, let's say, the technologies that has been developed, towards capturing and also storing the CO2, as part of Ghana, as part of government support in the US here, we are required to make these technologies available, right? So that is why some of us we try to have collaborations with sister universities in Ghana, to be able to transfer some of these technologies. Now, with regards to the financing, I do feel that at some point, we will see that advanced countries will be given some sort of support, for, let's say, less developed countries to be able to catch up. But I will say that with regards to the technology, Ghana has to see what they really want to do, and put up some support. It's not a big money because most of the heavy work has been done, but trying to build the support back home for our people to be able to utilize these technologies, to learn them, creating the avenues through research for us to learn them and more or less transfer what is critically needed for our use back home.
Thank you very much, Prof. Dr. Champon?
I wanted to add a little to that because
right.
it's an issue that I'm extremely passionate about. The money to fund the research and who should kind of provide that. And William is absolutely spot on. Same thing in Europe. You've got that three-way process between industry, academia, and then government and everybody, chipping in to solve the problem at hand. In Africa, I think even under the AU, we're meant to be spending 1% of our GDP, right, every year on research and development. And you can go and check the Ghana number. It's less than 0.5. I think the last time I checked it was even 0.00 something, right? It just shows you where sometimes our priorities lie. Both William and Rita were talking about this whole CCUS thing. I was going to ask, do we know of any institution in Ghana or in anywhere in Africa that is trying some of these technologies or at least modeling or simulating them and putting our monies where our mouths, right, really is? In South Korea and all these places, you have an active R&D ecosystem and the funding that goes to support it and to move it from creating lab products or services into commercial, ventures. It's not happening at the moment on the continent. So
Right.
even whether we're talking about CCUS or critical minerals or you name it, it comes down to money. And it comes down to how we prioritize ourselves. I struggle a bit sometimes, to see us allocating monies to buy, V8s and cars to drive around town, but we cannot have, that same $100,000 to buy a piece of equipment to do some research at a university that we can commercialize. That really is, at the heart of all of this conversation. We've got to get our priorities right.
That's right. Our priorities need to be set right. And that brings me to two questions for you, Dr. Tiwa Champon. The first question from Swatson says that, how do you mine for some of these critical minerals needed for energy transition? The heavy-duty machinery predominantly use internal combustion engines, which utilize fossil fuels. If we juxtapose the two, surely the impact needs to be accounted. Are we not shifting the problem from one side to the other? And the follow-up question from Joseph is this, so they can answer the two questions at once. It says, mining is not new in Africa. However, despite significant mining activities on the continent, it has not really fueled economic growth nor industrialization. Rather, it has fueled wars, corruption, and underdevelopment. So how different is this from what we have been doing before? Those are the questions from Joseph and Swatson.
Absolutely, very, very valid questions on the energy intensity of the mining process. I think that one is very easy to answer, actually, in the sense that quite a number of the mining companies these days are also adopting decarbonization technologies. So I know of a few mines, not in Africa, but like in Australia, in Chile, Peru, where some of the heavy duty equipment that would have been powered by diesel or petrol or any other conventional fuel is being now powered by, you know, solar cells and gas. And even now there's big talk of using hydrogen within the industrial mining space. So there's a lot actually happening. And it's all because of the pressure that these companies are facing to do something themselves in terms of their own emissions, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 type, you know, emissions. So something is happening in that space to reduce the energy intensity of that extraction process. But where Joseph is also right is that ultimately we're still going to need far more of these resources, and you need to spend energy to get them out of the ground and then convert it into other, you know, useful energy forms. And that comes to the second question, you know, that what's going to be new? After all, we've been mining 100 years. Same thing with oil and gas. We've been extracting, but these have not turned the fortunes of our countries on the continent, you know, around. There are different components or different responses to this, but I think at the heart of all of this is how you position yourself. So, for example, your local content policies, your R&D policies, all of these need to be looked at within a wider frame of your industrial strategy and what you want to do, right? You can go back to look at how the likes of your Taiwans and the Koreas and, you know, the Samsungs and the Daewoo's of this world were able to partake and now play a big part in the supply chain. If you don't break that, then I think we're going to end up in the same situation where the minerals will still be extracted from the continent and there'll still be little value addition. As we speak currently, China, you know, almost controls the whole supply chain for many of these critical minerals, especially when it comes to processing. So whether you're talking copper or lithium or cobalt, we take it out and then it goes there and goes back in other places. The US is trying to change that with their Inflation Reduction Act. The EU recently passed their Critical Raw Materials or Minerals Act and asked us, what does Africa have? We're still thinking about what to do.
Sad, sad, sad. I have a question for Dr. Jenson, and it goes thus. Hydrogen can be produced from diverse domestic resources, including fossil fuel, biomass, and water electrolysis. So my question is, how does this translate into the SDGG net zero carbon emission?
You mean the climate target of South Korea and as a climate target of country, and how this hydrogen production is translate into
the
achieving
SDG goals? Yeah, the net zero emission goals.
If I need to speak about the main area of application of hydrogen in energy strategies, first of all, it is being deployed at the power station with a mixture of natural gas or at coal power station. The first commercial use of hydrogen is, except hydrogen vehicle, is expected at power station, especially at coal station, with a mixture of ammonia, which believes that which will be helpful, believed to be helpful to decarbonization of power sector at coal power station. Then there are a lot of active subsidy on hydrogen vehicles in this region, but so far the electronic cars are very successful, and many people decide to prefer electronic cars to hydrogen vehicles, and other sectors. Of course, the products and technology not so ready, but there's also talks of active talks of using hydrogen in a large-size vehicle, which expert believes that hydrogen is more useful for bigger, larger vehicles than the passenger cars. So I believe that the Korean car manufacturers are now focusing on producing hydrogen-based trucks and buses, or industrial vehicles or military vehicle instead of passenger cars. I hope I answered the question.
Yes, you did.
And if it's okay, I could add a bit to that.
Sure.
Okay, yeah, so there are several SDGs where the hydrogen come in. We start with the SDG 7, affordable and clean energy, where we see, like Dr. Jisung has said, the hydrogen can be used as a fuel for transportation and electricity generation. And because it doesn't emit CO2, it's a source of clean energy. Then when we think about industry, innovation, and infrastructure, which is SDG 9, the development of a hydrogen economy, it requires the building of new infrastructure, including hydrogen production facilities, pipelines, fueling stations, a lot of which are being, there's undergoing research undergoing in this area. So this is something that hydrogen can drive innovation and create new industries, and including jobs. Then if we think about SDG 13, where we have climate action, hydrogen has been found to, we see it as a way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reducing fossil fuels in some of the transportation and industry sectors. So it's going to address the SDG 13. And then we talk about SDG 17, which is partnership for the goals, collaboration between government, industry, and other stakeholders, which is crucial for the development of a hydrogen economy. And so you would see now there are some collaborations between countries and different sectors, which is one of the things that a hydrogen economy is bringing. So it has a crucial role to play in the SDG in general.
Thank you very much, Professor Rita. And that brings me to two questions for you. The question is, did you encounter any social uncertainty, like social opposition or community resistance during your studies? And the next question goes that, do you consider plate tectonics and recent plate movement in selecting the site for storage? Thank you.
Okay, I'll start with the second question. So when we develop our site selection and ranking criteria, plate tectonics is very important. For instance, when I started my studies, it was done in California. California is one of those regions where we have plate tectonics, we have things like earthquake. So it's very critical that if we want to select a site for injection, it is not within 5 kilometers of where there's an existing fault or a known tectonic activity. So in our stage where we do exclusion, if we see a reservoir that is within 5 or even 10 kilometers near a fault that can be reactivated, we don't even select that site. That site is excluded. So that's at the site screening stage. Now, when we go into ranking, we look at which fields have the potential in the future to cause reactivation at the subsurface. So that's at a later stage when we start going into ranking and reservoir characterization. Now, the whole process of the site selection, ranking, etc. is holistic. We don't only look at the geology, we look at economics, and then we look at these social factors. And so one of the things that we considered is, if we have a site where there have been issues of environmental injustice in the past, we would not choose that site for CO2 storage. So it's not that have we received opposition, but we look at in the past what has happened. Maybe if they wanted to site a plant, was there opposition? What has been the environmental impact? Has there been increased indication of asthma in that region? If we know about it, then we're not going to cite our CO2 project there. If we have active sites where you have environmental justice bodies monitoring because of past issues, we also don't choose those sites. So we put them into our screening stages. So if we know of any issues, we don't even go there. So that's how we take into consideration the opposition, so that we don't even start a problem. Now, eventually, before you go to do a project, you need to ensure that you have access to the reservoirs below, and you're choosing a site where you don't have a large population of people, where people are living inside. And so our preference will usually be agricultural sites that have been abandoned for us to do that. And that way we do not get involved with communities or social issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Rita. I have two more questions before I call on our section chair to give us a closing remark. And the question goes to Barbara. Somebody is asking that, has there been any consideration for Islamic financing for this project, considering the repayment and not interest payment, but rather profits derived from assets or the project? So this is more like banking, the Islamic banking as against what we practice. Has there been any consideration in that regard?
Well, I cannot say for a fact that there has been a consideration into that. Even though the banks are being looked at, private finance is being looked into. But I don't know whether Islamic financing specifically has been considered. And I believe by referring to projects, the person is talking about the National Energy Transition Framework, if I'm to be clear. Yes. So I don't believe these have been looked at yet, even though the process is ongoing or will be initiated soon, actually, on determining what exactly the financing strategy is going to be. So, I mean, it can always be suggested.
Okay, well noted. I hope that answers Clarence Ayikwe's question. I'm going to ask this question to Professor Wumi. Prof, you have said that as Africa, we need to look within the continent and actually conclude on what we think is best for Africa as a continent, as against what the Europeans and the Americans are doing. What do you have to say in this regard?
So Professor Wumi is not online now.
Okay.
He is on his way from Cape Coast to Accra. So I think any of the panelists or speakers can take up this question. Thank you.
Yes, I'm going to, let me answer that question. So basically, every continent, every country has its unique energy transition plan. They have their unique energy security issues, and they have their unique energy resources. And so what Africa needs to do is look back and say, what are my resources, first of all? In some areas, we have a lot of solar. In some areas, we have wind. Some areas, we have natural gas. And some areas, we have oil. The focus is, how can we harness our resources in a clean and sustainable manner to be able to provide energy security and access within our region? If a region has more natural gas than solar, there is no point trying to move to solar when you have natural gas, but rather think of, how can I use natural gas and combine it with low carbon emission technologies, methane emissions, all those things, and still provide energy for my people. If I have hydro, which is what, I have sources of hydro, how can I harness my hydro rather than thinking of importing from another place? So we need to look at it based on our resources, maximize our resources where we are, develop the infrastructure that will help us. And there are different people that are looking toward. There are some people that want to finance solar, some want to finance blue hydrogen, some want to finance something else. So it's just taking into advantage what our immediate resources are and harnessing them.
Thank you very much, Professor Rita. I'm going to be taking the closing remarks from our speakers, and I'm going to start with you, Professor Rita, because you still have the floor on. Can we have some closing remarks with regards to today's topic?
So today's discussion has been very insightful. We haven't covered everything related to the energy transition and where Africa is, but I can tell you that what we have learned and listened to today is a step in the right direction. And I would just like to say that as we reflect on all the things we've learned, going from the financing and into the technical things, hydrogen, etc., we should also think about the educational sector, how we can improve the educational sector at the university towards, moving forward to be able to bring in these concepts into our curriculum and to have more support from the government at all levels in different sectors to be able to fast track the energy transition and maximize our existing resources. I think we have enough. We should just be bold enough to tap into what we have. Thank you all very much for the opportunity to share this floor.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Rita Okuru-Afo. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Dr. Jin-Sung to give us his closing remark. But before then, I would like to ask him that, will the production of hydrogen fuel have a significant effect on water scarcity? If yes, what measures are being put in place to mitigate that?
You mean the relation of developing hydrogen resources to water scarcity issues, right?
Yes.
In the hydrogen, in production of hydrogen, how do you say that? I haven't really related these issues. I think in South Korea, in developing green hydrogen or blue hydrogen issues, I believe in this region is more often the question is that a lack of electricity generated by renewable energy. So, and because in order to produce green hydrogen, we need a very large amount of electricity generated by renewable energy, but it's really the quantity of electricity generated by renewable energy is really not enough to produce green hydrogen. So it's one of the reasons that is cannot be the green hydrogen cannot be produced. And with in relation with the water scarcity problems, actually, I haven't encountered this issue very well, or maybe I haven't looked at it very closely. So far, it's not a critical issue in this region. But green hydrogen is really a big issue because not only is it expensive, because we don't have electricity from renewable energy.
Okay.
Please let me just say one thing, a few seconds. So,
right.
Just to highlight, as we generate green hydrogen, we are using water. We can take learnings from what has been done in the geothermal industry to use wastewater. There are some technologies where we can use wastewater from different processes, treat them and use them for electrolysis in areas where we have scarcity. But if we don't have scarcity, then it's okay to use the resources that we have from streams nearby and all of that.
Thank you very much. That as we do not really produce green hydrogen in South Korea or in East Asia, and also the countries are not experiencing water scarcity issues except China. In Japan and South Korea, we have enough inland water resources or wasted water resources or seawater resources. So at this moment, it's not becoming
South Korea.
Catching attention.
Okay, all right. And then any closing remark?
First of all, I'd like to thank very much for the invitation to this not only prestigious but also very interesting seminar where I can learn a lot of things from very experienced experts from different spheres.
Thank you.
I normally focus on the policy issues or economic issues, but only several subjects, especially natural gas and hydrogen. But I've learned a lot of things from a very experienced and very renowned expert from many different spheres. That it was a great opportunity for me to learn new things and also share a little bit of my experience and knowledge with the audience and with other speakers. And it was a pleasure for me to take part. And I would like to also, if possible, to share or ask for your expertise or knowledge after the session from other experts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jinson Sung. We appreciate your time as well. And so I'm going to call on Professor William Ampoma to give us his closing remark, but I want to ask him this. What is Africa doing in carbon utilization, and what could be the challenges in deploying this technology?
You know, in terms of carbon utilization in Africa, you know, based on the research that I've done, I don't see much, you know, but even in the US, it's still at research stage. You know, we are able to take CO2 and convert that into other products, you know. So it is something that can be transferred, easily transferred. And I will say that if you go to KNUST, you know, the chemical engineering department, there are some strong brains there, you know, where they are able to look at carbon and see what they can generate out of that. You know, so in terms of research stage, we are doing something, but in terms of deployment, it is still not there yet. You know, and even still in the US, it's still not fully deployed, but a lot of work has been done on that area across the world, but probably not much in Africa. With regards to my closing remarks, I would like to, you know, thank the team for putting this awesome program together. This is my first time participating in a webinar like this, you know, organized by the SPE Ghana session. So that was a great opportunity for me to share my knowledge as well. You know, I will say that as petroleum engineers, now if you go to even in the US, all academic institutions, petroleum engineering is really going down in terms of student enrollment. You know, it's still going down, and we're still trying to find ways to improve on that. But what I really want to say is that hydrocarbon is really not going anywhere anytime soon, at least for our generation. We are still going to utilize hydrocarbon even to help us as we transition to renewables. We do have the workforce, you know, so we should be proud of our education and our experience. We do have the workforce to be able to help with this transition. Even at CCS, we do have the workforce, you know, and expertise to be able to make this happen. But I would also want to say that, you know, Ghana should think about research, you know, in terms of coming up with our own path to net zero. We have to do it internally through research, you know, and at the same time, if we are able to do that, that is how we are going to be able to sustain that. So thanks so much for the opportunity, and hopefully we can do that again next time. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor William Ampoma. Of course, we need to invest more in internal research to be able to have our own paths with regards to the net zero emission. Of course, unless all of us here are ready to fly a solar plane, because I am not ready to fly a solar plane. So hydrocarbon is still here to stay with us, I think, within our generation. Thank you very much once again. I'd like to call on Dr. Tiwa Champon to give us his closing remark, and then I'll move to Mrs. Barbara. Thank you.
No, it's been a brilliant session. I have enjoyed it very much, very intellectually stimulating, and I wish a number of our policymakers were also here. I work within the policy space, and I'm privy to some of the conversations, but the point really is that this transition would create winners and it will also create losers. Unfortunately, that's the nature of the game and of development historically with where we come from. So it's going to be a zero-sum game. Indeed be, but whether or not as Africa, we end up on the winning side of the equation, or still wallowing on the losing side of the equation, comes down to the policy responses and the policy choices that we make. And this is where the three components of the collaboration between industry, government, and academia is really, really fundamental in terms of driving the agenda that we want for us as Africans ourselves going forward, and not what other people think is right for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tioa Champon. Move to Barbara. Barbara, where are the banks in Africa converging on financial strategies? And then you give us a closing remark.
Sorry, was that where or why?
Where are the banks in Africa?
Where are they?
Yes, converging on financial strategies with regards to all those projects that we have.
All right, I am not currently aware of any sort of convergence amongst the banks. I think the closest thing I can make reference to perhaps might be AFTA, and we'll need to find out what AFTA is doing concerning any sort of collaborative financing for projects across the region. So I think that's something to look into. And of course, there's I think the AFDB, African Development Bank, and I'm sure they also have certain interventions in the space. So I can go ahead and give my closing remarks.
Yes, please, you can go ahead and do that.
Right. I'd like to thank the organizers very much. It's been very insightful. Like everyone else has said, I'm grateful for the opportunity, and especially for the learnings. It's been a good eye-opener, and has allowed me to think about several things, especially the technical aspects of things coming from the economics and policy space. So I'm grateful to benefit from all these discussions, and I hope that everyone else here has benefited. And I'd like to say that I'm passionate about financing, especially for energy transition, because without that, especially in our context as Ghana and in Africa, we might not necessarily make progress as quickly as we think we should. So I'm grateful. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much to the speakers. We are very, very grateful for your time and giving us a very thought-provoking message today with regards to the various topics we all veered into. Thank you once again for taking time in sharing your knowledge with SPE members and the rest of the team. So I'd like to call on the session chair, Dr. Robertson Opon, to give us a closing remark. Thank you.
All right, Ruba, we could hear you, but we could not see you. That's fine. Even though the video is on, that's fine. So I also want to thank all of you present, all the speakers, Barbara, Rita, Song, William, Theo, for making time. I think most importantly, those who are based in the US who have to skip sleep today to make time for us. The two professors, Rita and William, we're sorry for that. But that's what SPE is. I mean, sense of volunteerism, and also sense of knowledge sharing. You cannot believe the amount of positive feedback we've received backstage, and people calling for a sequel of this session. So probably give you 6 months to go and come back again, and we'll see what we can do next. But I'm sure we're going to invite you either one-on-one or do a fireside kind of presentation. And we also expect Professor Rita to be in Ghana this year or next year for a deal. So Ghana session members, please, Prof is coming to Ghana on an SPE deal, which you're going to host in Accra. So those in other cities would have to fly over, or I don't know what you're going to do, but Prof is coming to Ghana, and I'm happy about that. We also want to thank the leadership of SPE for making time and making this work. As I said in the initial remarks, SPE is designated to share knowledge and also all in voluntary basis. I've personally learned a lot. People are asking me, Doc, why not on this panel? This your baby. This is your I mean, the topic. but I had to sit up and also listen to what we could hear from other professionals. Energy transition will happen, but it will take time. And I'm happy with what Prof said. I mean, harnessing your own resources first. So if you have the gas, baby gas. If you have hydro, baby hydro. And with that regards, you understand that Ghana is not doing bad, because in terms of thermal, gas to thermal, we're doing about 60% and hydro 40%. So we are getting there. But I mean, one of the cases that, one of the issues that we see is what the Champon addressed: the lack of collaboration between academia, industry, and government. Government is doing its own thing, academia is doing all stuff, and then the industry is doing their own things as well. But if you're able to collaborate and make things work, implementation of such policies will not be so difficult. Because one thing that you realize is that in Africa, not only in Ghana, we like to talk. We have all the best ideas, but implementing them is always an issue. So there's money to fund every project that you want. It all depends on how you put your proposal on the page or on the table, and how you allocate your equity on your debt in your project financing models, or whatever you want to call it. There's so much to talk about, but I want to close by thanking you so much. I don't think I can express our gratitude to you enough, but we are really, really grateful to all of you for making time for this. For those whose questions were not able to be answered, we are sorry. The questions were more than expected. I believe you're going to come back again. Stay tuned for other events. Next month, we're organizing the first ever African Student Congress here in Accra, hosted by University of Ghana. We have Uganda, Tanzania, Namibia, Angola, Chad. I mean, mention it. Every country that they have student chapters are coming here for this Petrobol, qualifiers, and SPC. If you happen to be in Ghana, please, if you're a champion, I know you're coming. If you happen to be in Ghana, please let me know, and then we'll surely host you. And that's how we bring the curtains down. I'll hand over back to the moderator to close us. But now, thank you so much once again for making time for us. And I'm sure we're going to take a group selfie or something like that. So, Dr. Tiachop, you're going to on your screen again, and we'll take our final picture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Riverson, for your closing remark. In the absence of any questions, comments, or concerns, we'd like to say once again, thank you all for taking your
we are taking a photo. Don't forget.
Oh, a good photo.
Yes, but you can't see you.
We need to see Rubabat, please.
Yes,
oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay, now you are free surface like a rabbit.
Today's Friday, so.
All right, so you come closer, and we'll take this snap immediately.
Okay.
All right. Okay, it's done. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you all, and nice meeting you all.
Thank you too.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone. Bye for participating. Thank you.